The cane cracked loud enough to stop traffic. A sharp, sickening snap, then silence, save for the blind woman's breath catching in her throat. She reached down, groping for the severed halves of the white fiberglass stick now scattered across the sidewalk like discarded bones. The officer didn't flinch. His jaw was set, sunglasses mirrored, posture wide. Around them, the city kept pulsing. Bus brakes hissed. A child somewhere cried. But here, on the corner of Broad and Lexington, the moment had ruptured time. If you're ready to hear a story that gets to your heart, click, like, subscribe, and tune into the wave of truth. This is not just a story. It's an experience that will leave a mark in your memory and make you see the world in a new way. The story of a woman who was tried to be broken, but she moved on. Move along, lady, Officer McKinley said, his voice lined with that smug authority reserved for men who mistook the uniform for godhood. You're blocking pedestrian traffic. I told you I was waiting for the light. The woman replied, calm but strained. Her voice, velvety and clipped, hinted at someone who had been forced to explain her right to exist too many times. Her name was Marian Dawson, 62, blind since birth. Her eyes were glassed but defiant. McKinley scowled, waving a dismissive hand like he was shooing a dog. You're loitering. And don't raise your voice. That a threat? He was already reaching for his cuffs. A crowd had begun to form. Phones out. A woman gasped audibly when she saw the broken cane. One man muttered, "What the hell is he doing?" But no one moved forward. Not yet. You don't know who you're messing with, someone said quietly from the edge of the crowd. McKinley turned sharply. Who said that? No one answered. Marian stood up straight, her hands still trembling around the shattered cane. You have no idea who I am, she said. And this time, her voice wasn't strained, it was steel. Officer McKinley laughed. Actually laughed. Lady, I don't care if you're the Queen of England. You mouth off to me, and you get dealt with. That's the law. But he was wrong, because the law wasn't what he thought it was. And the woman he'd just humiliated wasn't alone. Her son was watching, just not from the sidewalk. And in less than 48 hours, this man's entire career would be hanging by a thread. The cane had snapped, but something bigger was about to break. Marian didn't tell them. Not then. Not on the street where the crowd still whispered and the officer still hovered like a wolf convinced the lamb had barked. She simply straightened her coat, brushed the fragments of her cane into her purse, and turned her head to the sky as if measuring light she could not see. It was the kind of silence that holds back a tidal wave. And when she finally turned away, her steps were deliberate, guided not by sight, but by memory. She'd walked these streets her whole life. She didn't need their vision to navigate them. She didn't need their pity either. By the time Marian reached her apartment on the west side, the fragments of the morning's humiliation had hardened into something dense and cold inside her chest. She sat by the window, fingers pressed to her lips. Then she reached for her phone. Across town, in a sleek office wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass, Assistant U.S. Attorney Marian Dawson was mid-deposition when his personal phone buzzed twice, silent and coded. It was a protocol he and his mother had established years ago. She rarely used it. But when she did, he dropped everything. He left the conference room without a word. Outside, his assistant tried to intercept him. Sir, the DOJ's waiting on your. Push it, he said. His car peeled away from the curb 5 minutes later, merging into the early afternoon traffic like a bullet weaving through fabric. The city looked different today. Sharper. Hungrier. When he reached his mother's apartment, she didn't speak at first. Just handed him the shattered cane, its fiberglass edges jagged and glinting like broken promises. I want you to tell me, Jalen said softly, kneeling before her. She did. Not with anger, but with precision. She described the moment the officer grabbed her wrist. How he refused to believe she was waiting for the crosswalk signal. How he called her girl, like he couldn't see the lines etched by time into her face. And how, when she protested, he yanked the cane from her hand and snapped it across his knee like it meant nothing. Jalen didn't speak for a long time. But in his silence, things began to move. He knew the city, knew the department, knew exactly which cameras to subpoena, which judges to avoid, which unions would circle the wagons, and which names to leak first. Because what Officer McKinley didn't know, what no one on that sidewalk knew, was that Marian Dawson hadn't raised a victim. She'd raised the storm. By the next morning, a request had landed on the desk of Internal Affairs. It was neatly typed, clean, and devastating. A formal complaint citing Officer Ryan McKinley for excessive force, public misconduct, and destruction of personal property. Attached were the eyewitness statements of 5 bystanders, 2 video clips pulled from social media, and a notarized letter from Marian Dawson herself. But that wasn't what rattled Sergeant Howard Ortega of Internal Affairs. It was the signature at the bottom of the letter accompanying the packet, Jalen T. Dawson, Assistant U.S. Attorney, Civil Rights Division. Ortega sat back in his chair, the office buzzing around him like a hive, too distracted to notice the flame creeping toward it. He'd heard of Jalen. Harvard Law. Youngest Assistant U.S. Attorney in the Southern District. Quiet. Sharp. Dangerous. The kind of man who didn't threaten. He simply waited for your misstep and then buried you with it. Ortega opened McKinley's file. 7 prior complaints. All closed. All vague. Failure to de-escalate. Overly aggressive verbal tactics. 1 complaint, 5 years ago, had noted a pattern of behavior with female minorities, but it had been dropped without investigation. The witness refused to testify after receiving what was noted as departmental pressure. That was about to look very different under federal light. Ortega rubbed his temples. If this went wide, if Jalen Dawson decided to make this public, the department would be crucified. Not just for McKinley's actions, but for the years they'd looked the other way. Still, he didn't act. Not right away. Because IA had its own rules. And loyalty, even in the face of rot, dies slowly. Across the city, Jalen was already 5 moves ahead. He hadn't called the press. Not yet. He wanted the system to show its true face first. To confirm what he already knew, that it would protect McKinley. That it would circle the wagons and smother the story in silence. Then, only then, he would open the floodgates. In his office, Jalen pulled a small folder from the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside, a photo of his mother in front of the old community center she used to manage. A program she had built for blind women like her. Funded for 3 years, then quietly defunded after a councilman's brother accused the center of wasting resources. That councilman now chaired the Public Safety Committee. Jalen stared at the photo. His jaw set. This wasn't just about McKinley. It was about every man who thought breaking a black woman's cane was the same as breaking her power. They were about to learn the difference. Officer McKinley leaned back in his chair at Precinct 87, his boots kicked up on the desk, a smug grin working its way across his face. The buzz from yesterday had already cooled. Nobody was talking about the woman anymore. Not inside the precinct walls, at least. He knew how these things went. A little outrage, a clip on Twitter, maybe a protest or 2. Then it passed. Just like the last time. And the time before that. He'd been counseled once, suspended once, but the union always covered him. Always. What did you do this time, Mac? His partner, Ronnie Biggs, smirked as he walked in holding a coffee. Lady came at me with a stick. I stopped her from waving it around like a damn weapon, McKinley said, voice thick with mockery. Blind lady? Biggs asked. Yeah, McKinley laughed. But they all got eyes when the phone starts recording. Biggs didn't laugh. Not this time. Because he'd seen something different on the captain's desk this morning, a printed memo with one name circled in red. Dawson, Jalen T. And if that name was involved, this wasn't going away. Meanwhile, in the upper floors of City Hall, the Police Benevolent Union president, Anthony Kershaw, was on a call that carried a different temperature. How long before the video disappears? The voice on the other end asked. Kershaw didn't answer immediately. There's too many copies already. Some kid tagged it to the NAACP account, and there's a clip trending on TikTok. And the woman? Marian Dawson. Community activist. Blind. Good record. Not the type we can discredit without blowback. A pause. Then what are we doing about it? Kershaw leaned back in his chair, staring out over the skyline. Same thing we always do. Delay. Distract. Deny. But what? He hesitated. Her son. That's the problem. It's Jalen Dawson. Silence. Then, shit. Back at the precinct, McKinley checked his phone again. Still no official word from IA. Still no badge pulled. As far as he was concerned, it was business as usual. Until the captain called him in. Close the door, Ryan, she said, not looking up from the file in front of her. There was something in her voice. Something not protective. Something closer to fear. Because the machine had always protected him before. But this time, it wasn't just a broken cane. This time, he hadn't touched a stranger. He'd assaulted the mother of a federal prosecutor who knew how to turn the law into a blade. And now the blade was sharpening. Jalen Dawson wasn't sleeping. He hadn't slept since the night his mother called. Not really. Not the way a man sleeps when the world is quiet and just. He sat in his home office, tie loosened, sleeves rolled, documents splayed across his desk like an autopsy. Every complaint against Officer Ryan McKinley. Every use of force report. Every disciplinary action that vanished into smoke. He'd ordered them through legal channels, but the speed at which they arrived told him everything someone upstairs wanted him to have them. Quietly, without leaving fingerprints. That meant someone in the department knew the truth and was tired of pretending they didn't. He flipped open one file dated 2017. A traffic stop. Black mother. 2 kids in the back seat. The woman alleged that McKinley threatened to pull her from the car for asking why she was stopped. Complaint dismissed. Lacked sufficient corroboration. Jalen closed his eyes. He could hear her voice in the report, clipped, pleading, forced calm. The same voice his mother had used when Officer McKinley took her cane. But this case wasn't about pleading. It was about reckoning. He opened a fresh document and began drafting a motion. It was bold, audacious. He was moving to file civil rights violations not just against McKinley, but against the department, arguing a pattern of constitutional neglect that created the environment for McKinley to act with impunity. Most prosecutors would call it career suicide. But Jalen had learned a long time ago, justice doesn't come in whispers. It comes in waves. He was about to become the undertow. Elsewhere, Marian sat by the window of her apartment, cane fragments still in her lap. The news was on. She could hear the voices, measured and vague. They called it an incident. They used passive phrases, a confrontation occurred, a physical object was damaged. They never said what it was. Never said who did it. But people were talking. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing for days. Friends, activists, even strangers. Some offered condolences. Others asked for interviews. A few wanted her to speak at rallies. But she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. She didn't want this to be about noise. She wanted it to be about change. And Jalen, he was the only one she trusted to make that happen. Across the city, the gears of power were starting to grind. A federal complaint had been filed. The DOJ was aware. The mayor's office had requested a closed-door meeting. And Officer Ryan McKinley, for the first time in his career, wasn't walking into work. He was being summoned. The knock on McKinley's door wasn't loud. It was clinical, measured. But when he opened it and saw 2 plainclothes officers with Department of Justice credentials, the air inside his apartment turned thick enough to drown in. "Officer Ryan McKinley?" one asked. He didn't answer. He just stepped back, jaw twitching. "You're being served notice of a federal inquiry into your conduct involving an incident dated May 27th. You are advised to retain counsel immediately. You are not under arrest, but you are expected to appear at the U.S. District Office at 0900 tomorrow." They handed him the papers, thick with the weight of real consequences. McKinley didn't read them. Not yet. He just stood in the doorway, the morning light making his badge on the kitchen table look like a prop from a play that had ended. The next morning, he walked into the federal building flanked by 2 union reps, both old, white, and weathered from years of defending the indefensible. They moved like they owned the place, until they saw who was waiting in the conference room. Marian Dawson. No tie. Sleeves rolled. Face unreadable. McKinley's steps slowed, just for a moment. Because something about Jalen's presence wasn't procedural. It wasn't performative. It was surgical. He didn't even look up when they entered. Just flipped through his binder until the DOJ rep called the meeting to order. "Let the record show. This is the initial inquiry into federal civil rights violations involving Officer Ryan McKinley and Ms. Marian Dawson, a blind civilian. Present are legal counsel, department representatives, and Mr. Dawson, serving as lead civil rights attorney." The room fell quiet as Jalen finally looked up. His voice was calm. "Let's start with the body cam footage." The video played on a widescreen. It was short, under 3 minutes. But the silence it left in its wake was cavernous. There was no ambiguity. There was McKinley, leaning in. There was Marian's voice, steady, firm. There was the sound of the cane breaking. Audible. Indisputable. There was no resisting arrest. No raised voice. No threat. Just arrogance. And violence. One of the DOJ reps, a black woman with gray at her temples, leaned forward. "Officer McKinley, do you have any explanation for your actions in this video?" McKinley glanced at his counsel. They gave a tight nod. "She was non-compliant," McKinley muttered. "She was refusing to move. She was waiting for the crosswalk to change," Jalen replied. "She told you she was blind. You responded by destroying the only thing that helped her navigate safely. Do you see the problem?" McKinley bristled. I didn't know who she was. Jalen leaned in, voice like a blade. That's exactly the problem. The room went still. Because it wasn't just about who Marian was. It was about who he thought she wasn't. And this time, that mistake was going to cost him everything. By the time the inquiry recessed for the day, the headlines had begun to shift. What had started as a localized incident, one of countless moments where a police officer overstepped, was now bleeding into national news. Blind black woman assaulted by officer. Civil rights prosecutor leads case against local cop. Justice wears a cane. Jalen didn't talk to the press. He didn't need to. The images did the talking. Marian's cane in 2 pieces, captured on cell phone footage from 3 angles. The look on McKinley's face, half boredom, half disgust. The people in the background who had witnessed it all and stayed silent. That silence had shape now. It was evidence. Inside the precinct, morale was split down the middle. Some officers closed ranks, muttering about overreactions and cancel culture. Others fell quiet, thoughtful. Officers who had seen McKinley push boundaries for years but never spoke up, now wondering if they'd be next. Sergeant Ortega of Internal Affairs, meanwhile, had begun his own review. The files were damning. McKinley's record was dirtier than anyone wanted to admit, but the deeper scandal wasn't what McKinley had done. It was what the department hadn't. 7 internal complaints. 5 closed without review. 3 lost body cam files. 1 retracted witness statement from a mother who later moved out of state. Ortega stared at the names listed on the paperwork. Captains, lieutenants, union lawyers. His own supervisor. It was all there. A latticework of protection built around McKinley. And suddenly, Ortega realized something chilling. If Marian Dawson pulled hard enough, the whole damn web would come down. Elsewhere, Marian sat in her kitchen, fingers curled around a warm cup of tea. The city buzzed outside, and she could feel its pulse, tense, humming, watching. She had said no to every interview request, no to every protest appearance. She wasn't ready for the spotlight. She wasn't a symbol. She was a woman whose body had been treated like debris. And yet, she knew this wasn't just about her anymore. Her phone buzzed. It was Jalen. "Ma," he said gently, "it's going to get louder before it gets quieter." "I know," she replied. "And I'm not afraid of noise. But make sure it means something." "I will," he said. "I promise." Because justice didn't come from attention. It came from pressure. From facts. From strategy. And Jalen wasn't just fighting to punish a man. He was fighting to dismantle the system that had let that man rise. Officer McKinley sat in the union's legal conference room, sweat forming beneath his collar despite the industrial-strength air conditioning. His union rep, Steve Hart, a grizzled ex-cop with a knack for burying inconvenient truths, was pacing with increasing agitation. "They're not just coming for you," Hart muttered, rubbing his forehead. "They're coming for the department. You're just the face." McKinley didn't respond. His mind was spinning. He wasn't used to being the face. He'd always been the shadow, one of many who pushed the line, then watched it be redrawn behind them. He'd always assumed someone else would take the fall if the system cracked. But now the crack was widening, and his name was on the indictment draft. "Is there a deal?" McKinley finally asked. Hart stopped pacing. "Not yet. But Dawson's not dumb. He's a climber. Maybe if we offer him a bigger name, he backs off." "What name?" Hart paused, then lowered his voice. "Captain Linwood." The silence that followed was sharp. Linwood had overseen McKinley's precinct for years. He was old school, untouchable, the kind of man whose loyalty was currency. He also happened to be the one who signed off on every disciplinary file McKinley had accumulated and quietly buried. "You sure you want to go there?" McKinley asked, not because he was loyal, but because even he understood the rules of self-preservation. Hart didn't blink. "If it's between you going under and bringing Linwood into the light, we're bringing the whole precinct into the light." Across town, Jalen was in the federal building's war room with 3 DOJ lawyers and a whiteboard littered with names, arrows, and red lines. "This isn't about just one cop," he said, pointing to McKinley's name. "It's about the architecture of impunity." He circled the word Linwood. "Find every case where McKinley's conduct was flagged and Linwood signed off. I want timestamps, chain of custody reports, and I want to know how many IA files were marked as resolved without interview." One of the attorneys, a quiet analyst named Porter, looked up from her laptop. "Jalen, there's something else." She turned her screen. It was a sealed settlement from 2019, a civilian lawsuit against the department. Blind woman. Escalated force. Same neighborhood. Same officer. The case had been settled quietly. Confidentiality clause. The woman had vanished from the public eye. The city had paid $70,000. Jalen's stomach turned. This isn't his first, he said flatly. This is just the first they didn't erase. The room fell quiet. Because now, it was no longer just about justice for Marian. It was about finding the women who never got it, and asking what kind of machine was built to silence them all. Her name was Clarice Monroe, age 49, former city librarian. Diagnosed legally blind in 2017 after complications from glaucoma. Her file had been redacted in half a dozen places, her address scrubbed from public records. But Jalen's team found her anyway, buried not in databases but in footnotes. A name attached to a quiet settlement. A complaint never heard in court. Jalen sat in a small rented sedan outside a weathered apartment complex in the East End, watching the building as if it were a crime scene. In a way, it was. Every floorboard, every hallway, held echoes of what had happened. He called her 3 times. No answer. But he wasn't leaving. He buzzed her apartment again. And this time, the door opened. Clarice stood in the threshold, a scarf tied loosely over her eyes, head tilted slightly, listening before speaking. Her voice was rough, as if she hadn't used it much. "You're him," she said. "The lawyer." "Yes, ma'am," Jalen replied gently. "I'm Marian Dawson's son." That changed her posture. She opened the door wider. Inside, the apartment was dim and silent. Sparse furniture. No TV. A couch worn thin by solitude. Clarice moved slowly, carefully, her steps practiced but cautious. "I saw the news," she said. "He did it again, didn't he?" "Yes," Jalen said. "And they tried to bury it again." She let out a dry, joyless laugh. "They buried me a long time ago." Clarice recounted the day like someone reading from a ledger, dry, factual, precise. The stop, the shouts, the shove that knocked her down. Her cane kicked into the gutter. The officer's voice, angry and loud, like she had no right to be outside. It was McKinley. She'd filed a complaint. She tried to fight. But she had no video, no lawyer, no son in the Justice Department. The city offered her $70,000 if she signed and stayed silent. "I took it," she said, shame rising in her voice. "Because I couldn't afford to lose." "You didn't lose," Jalen said. "They did. They just don't know it yet." He asked her, gently, if she would be willing to testify. Not in court, yet. But on the record. For the DOJ. For his case. For every woman who never got the chance. Clarice hesitated. Then she nodded. "I may be blind," she said, "but I'm done being invisible." Back at the federal building, Jalen entered Clarice's statement into evidence. The pattern was undeniable now. McKinley wasn't a bad apple. He was a symptom. And the disease had a name. Institutional neglect. They had silenced Clarice. But they were too late to silence Marian. And Jalen? He was just getting started. By the end of the week, the mayor's office called an emergency press conference, thinly veiled as a public update on departmental transparency. Reporters packed into the municipal auditorium, most of them already aware of the real headline. Officer McKinley had been suspended without pay, pending a full federal investigation. But Jalen wasn't interested in headlines. He wanted the source. He wanted the department's complicity. He wanted Captain Linwood. Inside the federal office, Jalen was seated across from Linwood's attorney, a polished man in an expensive blue suit who smiled too easily for someone defending a man with this many ghosts. Linwood himself didn't speak, just stared at the wall like he couldn't believe the floor had shifted. "This is your offer," Jalen said. "You testified to the internal suppression of complaints against Officer McKinley, including the forced closure of at least 4 internal affairs reports, 2 of which involved vulnerable civilians. And we recommend leniency in your administrative review. No prison time. But you're done. Badge, pension, all of it. Gone." The lawyer leaned in. "You don't have enough. No audio, no whistleblower." "We have a witness," Jalen interrupted. He slid a manila folder across the table. Inside was Clarice Monroe's signed declaration, stamped by the DOJ, accompanied by copies of the settlement agreement. Redacted now, but not for long. Linwood's eyes finally moved. "She'll talk," he said hoarsely. "She already has." Jalen stood. "You build a fortress around Officer McKinley. But every fortress leaves cracks. And you forgot something, Captain. You forgot that women like Clarice, like my mother, don't break. They bend. And they wait. And then they rise." The silence in the room was suffocating. For the first time, Linwood looked like a man who knew he was no longer defending a position. He was digging out of a collapse. That night, the story broke nationally. Justice Department opens pattern or practice investigation into local police department. The article didn't just name McKinley. It named Linwood. It named the settlement. It named Clarice Monroe. And for the first time in her life, Marian Dawson was not just a name on a report. She was the name behind a reckoning. The march began on a Saturday morning without a single megaphone. No chants. No songs. Just footsteps, measured, quiet, relentless. They started at the corner of Broad and Lexington, where the cane had been broken. Marian stood at the front, her arm looped through Clarice Monroe's, their broken canes held like torches. Behind them came teachers, pastors, nurses, teenagers, lawyers in suits and janitors in uniforms, mothers with children holding signs that read, "Blind, not invisible. Justice has eyes. Protect the vulnerable, not the powerful." The crowd moved through downtown, thousands strong, wrapping around the federal courthouse where McKinley had been scheduled to appear for a closed-door deposition. It had been postponed. Officials said it was for security reasons. But Jalen knew better. They were stalling. He stood on the courthouse steps watching the crowd. His mother reached him first. She didn't smile. Just took his hand. "You did this," she said. "No," he replied. "You did. You just let me carry the mic." Clarice stepped up beside them. "They thought we wouldn't remember. But we remember everything." Jalen turned toward the cameras. He wasn't planning to speak, but silence was no longer a luxury. So he stepped forward, his voice steady but raw. "For too long," he said, "this city has called accountability an attack. It has treated complaints as noise and survivors as problems to be managed. My mother was not a problem. Ms. Monroe was not a problem. They were warnings. And we failed to listen." He looked out over the crowd, then back at the courthouse. "They broke a cane," he said. "But they woke a movement." The crowd erupted, not in chaos, but in purpose. And for the first time in decades, the system inside that courthouse wasn't the only one writing history. Because outside, justice had a new voice. And this time, it spoke with thousands. The following Monday, Officer Ryan McKinley sat across from a federal grand jury. His badge had been stripped. His service weapon turned in. His union attorney by his side, now sweating through his collar as if the very walls were pressing in. Jalen was not in the room. He didn't need to be. His case was airtight. Pattern of practice violations. Multiple women. Internal suppression. A video that showed, frame by frame, the moment authority turned into assault. But McKinley? He was unraveling. "This is insane," he muttered as they prepped him in the waiting area. "All I did was try to move a woman out of the walkway. It wasn't personal." The attorney didn't answer. Not anymore. He'd seen the tide shift. Public opinion. Internal opinion. Even judges who once buried their eyes behind policy were now squinting into the light. In the hallway, Marian Dawson arrived, not as a witness, but as a symbol. She wasn't testifying today. She wasn't required. But her presence made the walls lean a little closer to truth. As McKinley was escorted into the grand jury chamber, he locked eyes with her for the first time since the incident. No smirk. No sunglasses. Just an unraveling man facing the first woman who had ever made the system he abused fight back. Marian didn't speak. She didn't move. But her silence was louder than his badge had ever been. Inside the chamber, McKinley tried to redirect. Minimize. He used the words standard procedure, non-compliance, officer discretion. But none of it landed. Not anymore. Because now there was precedent. Now there were names. Now there was Clarice. And now there was Marian. Outside, Jalen was walking the perimeter of the courthouse when his assistant caught up with him. "They're recommending indictment," she said. "All 5 charges. Civil rights violations. Excessive force. Tampering with public records." Jalen didn't react. Not with a smile. Not with relief. He just exhaled. Because this wasn't the end. This was the standard being rewritten. 2 days later, a sealed indictment was made public. The city of Chicago was officially under federal scrutiny, not just for Officer McKinley's actions, but for what the Department of Justice called a sustained culture of indifference toward the abuse of power. It named 5 additional officers, 2 sergeants, 1 lieutenant, Captain Linwood. But Jalen's eyes locked on the final page, a list of incidents now reopened for civil review. 38 names. Most were women. 6 were legally blind. Only 3 had ever been granted hearings. Clarice Monroe was the first to call. "They said I can submit an appeal for damages," she said. "But all I really want is my name cleared." "It will be," Jalen promised. "And not just yours." That night, he returned to his mother's apartment. She was listening to the radio, public news, reading the names of victims like scripture. Her cane leaned near the door, a new one. Sturdy, unbroken. "Do you know how many people have come by this week?" she asked, not turning. "Probably a lot," he said. "Some just want to say thank you. Others want to say sorry." She turned toward him, her gaze distant but focused. "But none of them knew my name last month." Jalen sat beside her. "They know it now." She shook her head gently. "Not because I spoke, but because you listened." He looked at her then, not as a prosecutor or a son, but as a man who understood that justice isn't a verdict. It's a voice, one carried from survivor to survivor, echoing until someone answers. And now, finally, someone had. Across town, precincts were under audit. Internal affairs officers were being reassigned. One captain had quietly resigned. A city councilwoman requested a review of all departmental settlements over the past 10 years. The dominoes weren't just falling. They were being pushed, one name at a time. And at the center was a woman with no sight, but infinite clarity. Because Marian Dawson had never needed eyes to see the truth. She'd only needed someone to carry it. It was the largest courtroom in the federal district, a marble chamber with ceilings high enough to drown echoes. That's where the final pretrial hearing took place. Not for McKinley. His trial was already set. But for the city itself. The Department of Justice, flanked by civil rights attorneys, opened a formal pattern or practice case against the Chicago Police Department. Systemic failure. Racialized misconduct. Abuse of authority. And into that room, wearing a navy coat and holding her new cane like a staff, Marian Dawson walked. She wasn't there as a plaintiff. She wasn't there as a symbol. She was there as a citizen. The lead DOJ prosecutor nodded respectfully toward her. Across the aisle, the city's legal team fidgeted with binders full of polished denials. They were already trying to isolate McKinley, pretend he was an outlier. But the evidence said otherwise. The evidence said this was rot disguised as routine. And today, that disguise was being ripped away. Jalen took his seat beside the DOJ's table. He wasn't speaking today, his role was done. The case was moving on, and his name would fade from the headlines. But the truth? The truth would stay. When the judge entered, silence rippled across the room. She was a black woman, mid-50s, former civil rights litigator. The irony was not lost on anyone. This case, the judge began, is not about one officer. It is not about one woman. It is about whether a system designed to protect has instead been allowed to destroy. She looked directly at the city's legal team. "We will not use the word isolated today. The facts do not support it. What they support is something much heavier." Outside the courthouse, a quiet crowd stood holding signs, not of protest, but of remembrance. Printed faces. Names. Broken canes taped like crucifixes to cardboard placards. Justice is not hindsight. It's prevention. We are the evidence. Believe the silence. Inside, Marian stood slowly, and for the first time, addressed the room. "I didn't come here to punish a man," she said. "I came here because punishment is temporary. Culture is what endures. And this city's culture, this department's reflex, has been to treat women like me as debris. You don't investigate debris. You sweep it." She lifted her cane. "But I am not dust." The courtroom didn't applaud. It didn't need to. Because the reckoning wasn't emotional. It was judicial. And it had already begun. 3 months later, the courtroom gave its final ruling, a federal consent decree. The Chicago Police Department would undergo full structural reform, mandatory de-escalation training, an independent civilian review board, a permanent federal monitor, and the reopening of 42 prior complaints dating back a decade. But no decree could undo the crack of fiberglass on pavement. That sound lived on in every newsreel, every classroom debate, every whispered conversation between mothers teaching their children how to survive. And yet, something else began to live, too. Clarice Monroe received a formal apology from the city, along with reinstated benefits and a public ceremony honoring her as a truth-bearer. She didn't want the spotlight, but she stood tall, her voice unwavering as she said, "I spoke because I was tired of bleeding in silence." Marian received a call from the mayor's office offering a city commendation. She declined. But she did agree to one thing, a scholarship fund. The Marian Dawson Fellowship for Justice and Access. For law students, especially those with disabilities, committed to civil rights litigation. Jalen returned to quieter work, handling complex civil cases, mentoring first-year law clerks, visiting classrooms where kids asked him what justice looked like. He always answered the same. "It looks like standing when you're tired, speaking when you're afraid, and holding power to account, even when it holds a gun. One morning, he visited the site of the incident. The corner of Broad and Lexington now bore a mural, a woman walking forward, cane in hand, her shadow massive behind her, shaped like a lion. No names, no slogans, just 3 words, painted in silver. She kept walking. Jalen stood before it, alone. The city bustled around him, horns blaring, feet moving, lives colliding. But he saw only her, not as the woman who was hurt, but as the one who wouldn't let that hurt become the end of the story. Justice didn't arrive in the form of vengeance. It didn't roar. It echoed in laws changed, systems challenged, hearts opened. The cane had broken. But the truth? It walked taller than ever.